Hey guys, Thomas the Silly Genie here, aka Mustache Tom, here with a retrospective review of Digimon Season 1. So, this is perhaps a little something new, but and as well as combining it with something old. So yeah, if you end up enjoying this retrospective review, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, check out those links in the description. One will head you over to my petition to help out smaller YouTubers. Second and third to my Patreon and PayPal where you can help support me and my channel. And fourth to my Discord server where you can join, collab, and chill. And chilling will be reminded at the end of the review. So I thought it'd be a neat idea, since I've been rewatching Digimon as of recently, to actually properly review it, as old as it is. I've done reviews for older things in the past out of PayPal request or Patreon request, but this is something that I've been sort of tugging at as an idea for quite some time, and that is to go over one of my favorite shows of all time, Digimon Digital Monsters. In fact, for those of you who don't know, I started my channel with Digimon content. In fact, I played the game Digimon Masters Online, which is a terrible Digimon pay-to-win video game, if you heard my content way back then when I did not have a microphone. But that was in the past. As of now, my ability to review stuff has, at least in my opinion, has gotten better. How I see characters and story and all of that stuff that knowledge has gotten better. So I figure that this would be a great opportunity to look back at something that I held and cherished as a child and see which parts of Digimon held up as strongly as they do and which parts I would criticize as being as objective as possible, while holding on to some of that nostalgia along the way. So obviously, a little bit of a tricky one, but I'm always willing to go there, even if it is my favorite show, or one of my favorite shows in the past. So, for those of you who don't know, Digimon Season 1 premiered somewhere in 1991-ish, around that time frame. It's based, or it was inspired by Tamagotchi, for those of you not familiar with anything, and probably have, in the past videos of other people who have covered Digimon in the past, have made obvious references and comparisons to how it's not like Pokemon and, that whole debacle. So I suppose I might as well get that bit out of the way. Yes, I did technically watch Pokemon first, and I thought, I was a stupid young kid. I was enjoying the adventures of Ash and Pikachu and all that good stuff. And then there's other shows I was enjoying as a kid. And then one day, Digimon came out, and the first episode absolutely got me hooked, and I was watching every episode along its journey from episode 1. And I became way more enthralled in Digimon than Pokemon, as its story immediately gripped me a lot harder than anything I had seen up till that point in Pokemon. From what I can remember, that I was just way more invested in watching Digimon as a show. So, what makes Digimon so appealing is sort of the main question. Well, I suppose I'll start from a really broad perspective as far as like how the season was set up. So one thing that makes Digimon stand out, at least to me, is that its first season, quote unquote, comprises of 4 different villain arcs. Now, why that's unique, at least from my perspective, is that a lot of shows I have seen, usually a villain takes up an entire season's worth of content, usually. That's not always the case, but I think it's more common that that's the case. Again, that's my guess, anyways, of how this usually typically works, anyway. So it was interesting to go back to a show where the entire season comprised of like several different arcs of like these different villains, and our heroes would have to through these 4 or 5 arcs, depending on which places you consider arcs, are placed. So with that, we can sort of broaden inwards from that perspective and look at the characters. So, front and center, we have Tai and his Agumon. And on the left from him, we have Sora and Biyomon, we have Izzy and Tentomon, and we have Joe and Gomamon. And then to his right, we have Matt and Gabumon, TK and Patamon, and Mimi and Palamon as our main characters. Each brings their own little character arc that they need to go on. Their little, from a meta perspective, they have their marketing devices. The crest more so than the Digivices are also meta marketing, but they are the tools that enhance their abilities. So they work in the clear marketing into the character work that they wanted to establish for this show. So, for example, for Tai, he had the Crest of Courage, which came in at the second arc and had to deal with something that would test his courage. And same thing goes for every other character and their individual crest. Which we have Matt in Friendship, we have TK in Hope, we have Sora in the Love, we have Izzy in Curiosity, and the last two I'm gonna probably botch. I think Mimi's was Sincerity, excuse me, and Joe was, dang, I'm actually struggling to remember his. It was like Responsibility or something, or like something of that ilk. Anyway, point being is that each character had an obstacle to overcome as the seasons or as the arc, arcs plural, commenced. So let's go over each arc and how that commenced. So in the first arc, obviously we have our characters first being swirled into the digital world and are immediately enthralled into danger with Quagamon as like their first enemies that even allow them to turn into the forms we see on the poster here, because they're in their baby forms when we initially see them once they enter the digital world. After fighting that among other creatures, their big bad, the main villain, the main arced villain of this segment was Devimon, as in, yes, the biblical, representation of the devil. And he was destined, quote-unquote, to be beaten by an angel. And from so it is pretty basic, basic good versus evil here, right? And, it doesn't get more obvious than a literal devil versus a literal angel. However, in the context of Digimon, and with the knowledge of meta and time having passed, I do think that there's a little bit more to chew on here in the context of it being in the digital world. And why I say that, as someone who used to be religious and kind of stopped believing, I guess, or however you want to put that, I still do find religion fascinating in a way to look at as a sort of and I try to keep an open mind for that kind of stuff. But what I find fascinating is if you believe in God to its highest, like he created the universe or whatever. Like he created the Big Bang, let's go that far. Uh, then surely, if God did that, then surely he also gave human beings the knowledge to build technology, right? He must have, like, if that, because that must have been God's will, right? Like, again, this is why I find religion gets a little bit fascinating, is like when you push it up against science. Um, so yeah, I find that sort of meta sort of look at it to be quite fascinating about like thinking about like what does it mean that God also created or sort of helped create technology in a way, and how technology, like a lot of things in this world where a lot of people will say like uh, technology bad, or like they'll take the extreme stances of like, or like capitalism bad, or like whatever is bad, right? Instead of doing that, being like, hold on, let's back up and pull it back and go, maybe it's neutral. Let's look at it that way. Like, there are bad elements. We're not even going to disagree with that, actually. But we're also going to present you with, well, what about the good elements? What possible good elements could come from technology, right? And obviously, there are some pretty easy examples, like medicine and, how far we have come with, like, medicine and all that stuff. That's all granted with in combination with technology, if we're following that logic to its conclusion. um, and of course it was messy to get to that process. Not saying it was a perfect process by any means, no, but I'm not going to say that it's all bad or all good. Again, neutral. There are good elements and bad elements within it, and I think that this show sort of opens up that discussion without diving too crazy deep into it. Anyway, so obviously TK and Patamon are the ones that are responsible for defeating Devimon, as Patamon is the one to be able to digivolve into that angelic-like form that we see at the end of the first arc. So, a pretty standard first arc, and we kind of get a gist of, like, this world is perilous. Uh, However, the good elements of technology are beside them. Agumon and all of these Digimon are, like, digital representations. They're digital creatures with, you know, which is a concept back all the way in 1990, which, I would find probably way more fascinating back then than it is now. And even now, I would be like, damn, that's still, like, we're, like, inching towards, like, a whole slew of different stuff that's, like, can be perceived as, like, bad, obviously, in technology with, like, AI and stuff like that. Um, but, still having that potential to be like, oh, but what if we could access and create a digital world, like how the show brings out in later seasons, um, and give, like, well, a separate life to these digital entities, and what does that mean, entering that whole equation. Because there are arcs of characters in later Digimon series of characters being like, well, this Digimon's this digital data. Doesn't matter what happens to them. And then later on, it's like, well, no, they have personalities, they have feelings, they have, they're beings. So their quote unquote life matters too. So they do raise that standard eventually. Not so much in season 1 or arc 1 per se. I suppose the littlest test of that is with our main character in Tai feeling courageous when they are told that they are digital beings, and therefore he assumes that the harm that they have been facing prior actually doesn't really matter. So he bravens up, and then it's Izzy who informs him, well, actually, despite that, it's sort of like the equivalent, and I know this is like, what about this other thing, but I suppose it technically can relate to a degree, the Matrix, of like, well, no, what happens there happens here in the real world, so there are consequences, and you can still perish. And so that makes Ty freak out, as he assumed, that sort of idea that he was fed into, that this whole thing was digital, that must mean it was fake, that the consequences weren't real. But no, as he informs, the consequences are very much still very real, and that instills or reinstills this fear as he's in front of this wired cage, and then he has to like step through it as this appears to be, the segment appears to be that Izzy's pointing to appears to be an illusion. So he has to regain that courage that he suddenly lost when told that that this world does have consequences. So there are things like that it does begin to test the idea of just because this world is digital, it still has consequences. These beings that we are surrounded with, these digital monsters, again, you can very much lose them too. Every battle is a potential consequence. You could lose your digital partner, and that would be an emotional breakdown, and we would see a little bit more of that as the series progresses. However, after this arc, we get our second arc, and I will say it does have one unique feature that is passed down to every other Digimon, or for the most part, most other Digimon shows from my memory. That being our main character pushing their main Digimon, that being Agumon in this case, too far to face the next opponent, and then in that push creates a true monster, in the sense of like a senseless monster in Skull Greymon. Now, I will say the enemy in Arc 2 is a bit of a joke in terms of design, and everything about him essentially is kind of a joke, except his quote-unquote power level, which is why I'm like, it's so frustrating that Edamon was season, or Arc 2, I keep wanting to say season, was Arc 2 villain. Edamon is a monkey-looking Digimon, a yellow monkey that does... I'm talking about the dub version, obviously, so he does the whole rock and roll Elvis impression voice. So he's a bit of a joke in terms of his attitude and performance, in terms of all that. So we went from the literal devil to a monkey that does Elvis impersonations. It's like, Digimon, what are you doing? I'm sorry, like, what is this? What is this joke that you've downgraded us to in terms of villain? If there was a villain arc, I would get rid of, like, say if I were the one writing Digimon, rewriting Digimon, and remaking it, say today. That is definitely the arc I would immediately get rid of, and just shift Ty's, rage arc to get Skull Greymon to the next arc, obviously. And then just to make sure that time is spent in enhance the next arc, which we'll get to momentarily. But for the time, our tamers are now looking for the crest, as I mentioned prior. They have to... It's more so about finding the crest, and then the latter half is about some of them achieving, or all of them achieving, said quest, like achievement status 1, which I also think could have also just been handled in Arc 3 anyways as well. So I don't think anything that happens here couldn't have also been achieved in the third arc of their third villain. Because again, Edamon just is a complete downgrade in every regard, of terms of like, oh, we're down here now. Okay. But fear not, as after they defeat Edamon, and now that I'm moving on, we can move on to the most interesting arc, in my opinion, of the four, or slash five, depending on what you consider the arc. So, enter Myotismon. Myotismon is an interesting Digimon, sort of similar in vein to Devimon, in that he feeds off of a more like horror-themed thing like Dracula, for main example. So, a deeper mythology that you can follow. And while that's, you might think that that's a downgrade again from the literal devil, I think what they do with Myotismon, though, still is an improvement from Devimon, though. They have Myotismon travel to the real world, which is already a major upgrade from what Devimon was doing, which was just maintaining in the digital world while challenging our tamers up until TK and Patamon digivolved their first time. However, Myotismon clearly has bigger plans, and with bigger plans comes a bigger army. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting in Arc 3, and I would also say best character arc and best character are introduced, and it's not even a human. But they are told to find the 8th Digi-Destined, and with it, their Digimon. Now, earlier translations, based on everything here, is that they were just assuming that their next 8th tamer was a guy or a boy that must have been in the sequence that we see them talking about, which was this fight that is in a completely different Digimon movie, by the way, detailing how each of these tamers were present for this battle, which made them the quote-unquote Digi-Destined, which I suppose is a fine time to bring up this whole Digi-Destiny thing. Now, what I find, I suppose, fascinating about the Digi-Destiny, I suppose we'll call it, is that its transformation, I think, has been an overall improvement from Season 1. Obviously, Season 1, it was very much, these are our Digi-Destined, these characters here. Meaning, it was their destiny to be the heroes. They were fated to do this, not that it just happened to be a convenience that they are all there. And I think that's a interesting distinction to make between a convenience that they just happen to be there over destiny. Again, destiny has this connotation of being predetermined, as in, it was always going to be like this. And despite it always going to be this way, they still find themselves struggling. Just because they were destined to be the heroes, they still struggle, they still grow as characters. So, this whole destiny thing is kind of pushed in a way that I'm not too familiar with in recent content, in that being that even when characters of the old, like classic vintage Star Wars as the immediate example of like someone I can remember of like someone who is destined to do something versus them still training to having to meet their destiny, aka Luke Skywalker initially, that was the mark of like what it used to be of the vintage hero's journey of like you were destined to do it, but you still gotta work to reach that destiny. And again, rather than it just being a convenience that they just happen to all be there present for this moment, and because they happen to all be there, someone else chose them to be destined to do this. So again, I do think that there is a hint of a challenging of that word of what destiny means, I suppose. So yeah. Anyways, as they are being challenged and pushed, they also have to simultaneously look, again, as I was mentioning, for the 8th Tamer. And it just so happens to be Tai's younger sister, Kairi, who's not on this poster, but she has the most interesting character in Digimon Season 1, that being Gatomon. And the reason she is fascinating is that prior to being with Kairi, she actually works under Myotismon. She's on the villain's side. And with her, she has her other minions. We have Devimon, who is pretty much a joke consistently throughout, so that's a hit or miss on... I think it's a bit more of a miss. It's like, whatever, he's sort of a distraction, quite honestly. But there are other characters who are there as well. We have Wizardmon, and then we have little bits of other characters we'll get to momentarily. So I'll focus on Gatomon and Wizardmon first. So of those two, I already mentioned that Gatomon already has the most interesting little arc here among our crew of current Tamers. So we learn that she was physically abused by Myotismon to put her in her place. This was a kid show that had that as its premise for its character that was introduced for kids in the 1990s. So I really enjoy how this show challenged and pushed the envelope, even way back then, of what you could potentially show in a show. With a physical marking you see on Gatomon's arm, or paw, underneath her glove, you see the cross mark of her injury that she suffered from Myotismon very clearly. And we have a lot of distinction of him consistently mentioning her eyes, of being a threatening stance of whenever she looks at him with this disdain later on in the season, when she starts to realize that her quote-unquote destiny, here comes that word again, wasn't to be under Myotismon at all, but rather under Kairi as her Digimon partner. And it took Wizardmon, this sort of I'm not sure if I want to say father figure or like older brother. This is one of the issues I do have, despite recognizing that Wizardmon has a crucial moment here that's coming up relatively soon in this sort of review / retrospective that used to get to me back then, but looking back on it now, I do recognize that I think they could have worked a bit harder to achieve that. I do think that the pacing of Gatomon's, and more particularly Wizardmon's story, comes across as relatively broad and rushed. And I do think that, again, if they had, just removed Edamon's whole arc and replaced all of that with Myotismon's arc, so that would have been like an additional 10 episodes, up maybe a little bit more, because each arc was about up to 10 episodes approximately, maybe a little bit addition depending on which arc you're referring to again. But point being is that I do feel like Wizardmon's whole journey here is, again, both broad and pretty quick for the moments we see him. He's only in a few episodes from his journey that we see him initially pop up, then we see him sort of hint that he's more so on Gatomon's side, and then talking with Gatomon and having her remember that she saved his life, so he felt as if he was in her debt. And so that was sort of the subsequent events that led up to Wizardmon playing this role of sort of this protector of Gatomon, sort of to return the favor, and again in this broad sense. So So he sacrifices himself. He's dusted away back into the digital world. Um, and obviously, in the English versions of these, you get like they were erased or like brought back to the digital world instead of I think in the Japanese, if I remember correctly, they just say killed. Um, so they do actually mention that in the. So I'm not sure if they wanted to go like full on resurrection or whatever it is, which is uh, uh, what I thought I'd mention there. So obviously there were some translation issues in the dub, and this being an early dub, there were some times when characters, even as obviously as early as season 1, were marking these weird sort of side tangents about whatever that had nothing to do with anything. Sort of came up from time to time, and that sort of remained consistent throughout all of season 1 of Digimon, which is, I think, a little bit unfortunate. Obviously, later Digimon seasons also had that, and it started to decrease as translations would get better over the years. Anyway, so Gatomon, obviously, from that moment, turns to the good side, and I do think that, again, if I were in control, sort of behind the wheel of this show, again, I think I would have allowed those two a longer breathing opportunity to really flesh out what Wizardmon's role really was, to like sort of have a more pinned down, defined, like, how does he see Gatomon as? Like, as a daughter, question mark? Like, as a someone he owes a favor to? Was it as simple as that? I don't know. Again, they sort of just leave it up in the air, which again I think is rather unfortunate. And I do think does a little bit disservice to the character of Wizardmon. And speaking of short episodes with our characters from Rertrospective's army, we have the introduction of two characters that have one episode. They have one episode, and boy oh boy, do they stand out. That being Pumpkinmon and I think it's Rockmon. It looks like a rock anyway. I think its Japanese name is slightly different, or its actual name is slightly different, but I'll just say Rockmon for now, just for simplicity's sake. These two goofballs work under Myotismon, and in this one episode, everyone's sort of split up at this point. And we're following currently TK and Matt, and their whole journey, which their little arc in this segment is that Matt is realizing that TK is growing up and grew up a lot faster due to the events of the digital world, whereas he thought he always needed to be the protector as the older brother, but now seeing and hearing TK say that he can protect himself and seeing that through Patamon and himself standing up to the villains more so subsequently here, Matt feels a lot less useless, as he felt like that was his only role to contribute to the team, as sort of TK's guardian, and then the whole friendship thing kind of was cast aside as like, well, that's that, I guess. But nonetheless, we see that these two chuckleheads take the opportunity to do some shenanigans, like jump on a lamp, like a street, like a green light, red light, yeah, that sort of lamp post, and like sort of rocket. Luckily, their shenanigans of messing with the lights doesn't actually cause anyone to like crash or anything like that. So their shenanigans don't lead to anyone getting harmed, which is something I wanted to mention up in the front, as that is the first segment we sort of see them in. And then, you know, they bump into TK and Matt, and they're like, oh, we're under, they eventually admit that they are under Mayoda-spawn, so they're getting ready to fight, and then they're like, nah, we don't want to fight, we just kind of want to mess around on the town, and kind of just want to explore the human world. This world is rather fascinating. So we continue to just follow them a bit as they continue to do more shenanigans, like, since they don't have any concept of a lot of what happens in the real world, they go, like, gambling without, like, anything really, and so they get kicked out. They sort of mock this woman's look, so they kind of don't really understand, like, how humans function in that way, where they can get offended by, like, mockery in that sort of way of what they look like, so they get shooed away from that group, from this woman as well. We see them, quote-unquote, window shopping, in which they, express their genders. Oh yeah, I'm gonna throw that word back in a masculine and feminine clothing. They swap, like in a traditional, masculine sort of depiction of boys' clothing and a traditional feminine clothing. One has one and then one has the other, and then they trade. So they're just fooling around, expressing their gender. Oh yeah, we're going there. They're having a fun time. Why not, right? They're exploring, just having fun, not harming anybody, technically speaking. They technically broke rules, but they didn't cause any official harm again. That needs to be replicated, I think, and to reinforce their punishment for fooling around. They were told explicitly again by Mayoda-spawn, you need to fight these two. And they're like, okay. And then, like, moments after they're, like, told to, like, again, fight, they're just like, yeah, we'll fool around some more. So when they're caught a third time by Mayoda-spawn, he zaps them away. In the Japanese version, they say it, that he kills them, and then in the dub, they say they simply send them away back to the digital world to, like, re-code them or whatever it was. The point being, they have that one episode and they completely steal the show in that one episode. And boy, I think that really set up, like, something that I do think that it's a little bit missing in the last arc, is, like, the continuation of that sort of trend because of one of the Digimon that we see. And yeah, so we'll get to that in just a moment. So TK and Matt are generally upset because these two, again, as I was saying, they were, again, fooling around, but again, no one got hurt. So they were harmless enough, and yet they were punished in the Japanese version to death. That was their punishment. And it's like, Jesus Christ, what an intense little moment, from shenanigans to just like, oh, they're just gone now. Again, in the Japanese version, where in the dub it's just like, oh, they're gone from Earth, but, well, we won't see them again, I guess. But they'll be around in the digital world, I guess. So yeah, that upsets them, TK and Matt that being. But there's continued struggling as our Tamers and Digimon struggling to beat Mayoda-spawn, and then we get the further evolutions and Digivolutions that allow them to conquer Mayoda-spawn, and then Venom Mayoda-spawn not too shortly after Mayoda-spawn. And of course we have to also deal and overcome with on top of all of that going on, the parents figuring out that their children have these Digimon, to these side conflicts that we've been sort of learning about along the way, like Izzy being adopted, for an example, TK and Matt's parents being divorced as a continued example here. and seeing that whole play out, being the two, Sora being unconventionally masculine in her gender expression, aka dressing more masculinely. I know, I'm throwing that word out a lot. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. All the way back in the 1990s, gender expression. How fun. How fun that is to separate it from sex and say how easy that is to do. Funny that. Anyway. So, whereas Sora's mom is more traditional in her approach, more feminine too in her approach. So there's that divide of gender roles and how you're expected to be versus what you are. So nature versus nurture, even, broadening that out to its most extreme case of like, yeah, I'm gonna shock everybody on the politics. I recognize that there are, or back then there would have been two sexes back then, before we knew and discovered that there was a third sex of intersex. But back then, when there was two, when we only recognized that there was two, that correlated with the gender and understanding of gender of like, well, since there are these two, we'll socially create these rules that apply to each sex, and thus became the gender norm for a while. And then as early as 1990, we had characters like Sora breaking the mold, being like, you don't have to play the part. You don't have to dress femininely like Mimi, who's right there as an additional character, but she's fine with her gender expression. So it's saying, like, both are fine, guys. You can do both. Oh my god. And they're both female. Oh, scary. Oh, getting a little complex here about the discussion of sex and gender in the world of Digimon, a show that came out in 1990, and it is able to explore all of this all the way back then. Fascinating. So you can pull that away from something as early as Digimon and seeing the differences between sex and gender. And more importantly, gender expression, as Sora clearly expresses her gender, what she thinks is assigned that isn't what is, back then socially, is something that she doesn't need to be. She can be the soccer playing female, and that's fine. All the way back in the 1990s, separation of sex and gender. Ladies and gentlemen, we got 'em. If you didn't think there was a separation of sex and gender, spoiler alert, there's a thing called a gender reveal party that used to craze the nation back in the day. And while it was to reveal the baby's sex, they expressed it through gender, and gender recognized colors of blue being for boy, the tie color we see right there on the poster, and pink also being for the girls, as you see Mimi right there on the right. Pink, Biyomon, pink, female, pink, Biyomon, pink. So gender expression right there on the poster. So don't get it twisted. Again, that was the gender aspects of placing the color to the sex. And then, just historical fun fact, it used to be flipped. The blue used to be for women and pink used to be for guys, and then it flipped. And then you can really break any argument between sex and gender, just be like, okay, so once you can get someone to recognize that there is a difference between sex and gender, if you can, otherwise they're stupid, or not acknowledged enough to know that there's a difference between sex and gender. But once you can actually get them there, then you can really break their minds by saying, well, since there are the colors of blue being for boy, so we can exposit the phrase blue is a masculine color but not a boy's color, and pink is a feminine color but not a girl's color, meaning that blue is not the ownership of boys and pink is not the ownership of girls. But we do approximately recognize that socially, that in the 1990s, as early as then, that more boys just happened to like blue and more girls just happened to like pink. And that was socially reinforced in shows very much like Digimon, while also simultaneously challenging that very same gender expression by having characters like Sora breaking the gender mold. And then you have colors like, well, what about white and black? Well, they're gender neutral. Oh no, gender isn't a binary. Oops. I've broken the code, everybody. I did it. And it's all represented here in Digimon. And I can make a whole separate video about that and make it shorter, but here we are. Anyway, so enough about that. So we have the breaking of all those molds. We have the beating of Myotismon and, his potential conquering of Earth, and the more interpersonal relationships that are at stake as well. So there's quite a bit going on at Season 3, which is why I would again extend that wanting to see a lot more of the third arc being pushed into and just replacing everything that is the second arc and just making that one arc. However, our fourth arc, once that is handled, deals with the four Dark Masters, as they might be referred to as. And in this sequence, our tamers return back to the digital world. Now, the interesting aspect of this is that the time differentiation that is made very clear here is that a lot more time has passed in the digital world, as when they were in the digital world, time seemed to be at a standstill back on Earth. Meaning that it's completely flipped, or however you want to put that. Anyways, so there are these four Dark Masters. We have Metal Seedramon, Piedmon, Puppetmon, and Metal Greymon, Metal Greymon. Not Metal Greymon, excuse me, Machinedramon. We have those four, and our tamers having to deal with them. So, our tamers deal with Metal Seedramon first. Pretty standard battle sequences and just them recognizing how they can defeat him using the methods that they just already have, but just utilizing them to the best of their ability and having allies to help them and further sacrifices of more Digimon along the way, like Waymon in this example. Now, this brings me to Puppetmon is next, and when I was watching it just a few days ago, I was thinking Puppetmon feels like the extension of the fun characters of Pumpkinmon and Rockmon here, so I would think that the extension of his quote-unquote defeat would be in a similar vein of them not even having to fight Puppetmon, but sadly that is not the case. So, yeah. Not a fan of that. I feel like, again, Puppetmon is very much endeared in that sort of mindset of a child. Very much as those two were. And TK was, again, sort of the head of this sort of conflict once again. And sort of having that reversed as this little sequence of events was going on, kind of just, I don't know, something about it just feels like, again, it could have been a better extension of, the tamers are realizing that some Digimon just need a better way to learn, and, they actually defeat Puppetmon without defeating Puppetmon in a way. They sort of like convince him to just stop or something. Something along those lines that just fits sort of like the character archetype that Puppetmon seems to feed into, which is, again, it seems a lot closer to, again, Pumpkinmon and Rockmon from that one episode, just extended to a few more episodes with its proper defeat. And then there's Machinimon and Piedmon. Piedmon being the finale of that set. And then, as I mentioned, there's then sort of the final arc as Apocalypse, and that's our final test of our tamers in Digimon, where they have to use all of their power and all of their combined efforts to essentially put him at an end. And we have our somber exit at the time of our Digimon and tamers saying goodbye to one each other, and that they would see each other again, which we would see years much later as a subsequent time lapse happened in real life, that being between those sequences. And then it would follow that the tamers got a little bit older, and so on and so forth. But that was Digimon Season 1. Obviously, looking back on it now, I do think that it does have its issues. As I mentioned, I think Arc 2 was was the weakest, and a lot more could have been fed into the most interesting arc, which is, again, the one with Myotismon and them dealing with the human world and all of that stuff. And, like, there were so many little more introduced elements, like, again, like Gatomon, Wizardmon, these two others, and Gutsumon and Rockmon, and so on and so forth, that I think that expanding upon that should have been what should have been the key to that the arc, or, you know, whatever you want to call it. But I would still say, despite my issues with Season 1, I would still say it's overall still pretty solid. The characters still drive the story. They still, despite it being a Destiny-set story, which something can, you know, that word is just a phrase, and I see it of one of two ways. You can either do it like something like that as a setup as something that can be done really poorly, or something that can be done really great. Again, it's all in the writing. And in the case of this, I think the writing serves to do it really well, and for the most part. And that being is that despite it being their destiny, they are still consistently pushed throughout each arc in different ways. And I do think that that is the better alternative in this scenario of the arcs that we do currently have in Digimon Season 1. So I would still overall say that Digimon Season 1 is still a solid show. I'd probably give it like that solid 7 out of 10, maybe even a 6, possibly pushing it for Arc 2, considering how much I dislike that arc. And just, like, again, push over that the whole Skull Greymon part to Arc 3 would be my fix for that whole thing. Because that's, like, the main thing that happens that's, like, of any subsequent value or any substance of, like, oh, the character is really being pushed here, you know? So, yeah. That is sort of my full review / analysis of Digimon, a look back, a retrospective review of Digimon Season 1. And I don't know, if you guys enjoyed that full thing and want to see me tackle Season 2, 3, 4, whatever, additionally, let me know in the comments, if you've even made it this far, honestly. I know these kind of reviews since it's encroaching on an hour, tend to maybe pull some people away, perhaps, I don't know. But if you did stick around and want to see me tackle season 2, 3, and 4. Let me know in the comments, because I don't know if I want to do that right now, considering how much time this took to sort of compile my thoughts in this way. Just know that this is off the cuff, this isn't scripted, so that's how talented I suppose I've become of being a reviewer, is that I'm able to just sort of go off the cuff and really just still be able to make really solid points, I suppose. But anyway, that is my sort of retrospective review of Digimon Season 1, and if you enjoyed this full thing, then please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Also make sure to check out those links in the description. Want to head over to my petition to help out smaller YouTubers, second and third to my Patreon and PayPal, where you can help support me and my channel, and fourth to my Discord server, where you can join, collab, and do all that cool stuff. And until next time, everyone, bye-bye!